Welcome to the Avram Davidson universe, where you will get to listen to some of the best short stories ever written. As a youth, Neil Gaiman fell in love with Avram's stories. Philip K. Dick adored him. Ursula Le Guin thought his tales wonderful, and Ray Bradbury compared him to Kipling. Each episode will include a special guest, an amazing short story, and a discussion of that story. Enjoy classic tales such as O'er All the Seas with Oysters, The Golem, The Sources of the Nile, and many others.
How could you be? It sounds like a story to me, yeah. Sounds like a story to me.
I'm really looking forward to interviewing Alexander James, who will be here momentarily. With that said, I just wanted to make an announcement. I'm requesting that if you're enjoying the podcast, please join the Avram Davidson fan club at www.avramdavidson.com. Again, www.avramdavidson.com. I do this out of love for Avram, as well as to make sure readers of the next generation, as well as writers, continue to know who Avram is. Please also take some time and write a nice review. I do this for free, and I want everyone to enjoy it, and I want more people to enjoy it. And also share it. Let other people know that you're enjoying it. Put an announcement on Twitter that you just listened to it and it was great. Put a review on here. Put something on Facebook, spread the word, share the stories, and then ultimately, not yet, but once we start launching some new publications, some new stories, buy some of Avram's stories. Again, maybe as gifts, get the word out there. We are now being listened to in over 70 countries, which is just phenomenal. And I can't wait to have more listeners who get to enjoy Avram's work. So thank you. Up momentarily is Alexander James. Alexander, how are you?
I'm doing great, Seth. How are you?
Good. Thank you so much for joining.
Yeah, I'm super excited to be here.
Yeah, Melissa Rogers raved about you and said that you were someone I should definitely talk to, and I appreciated you sharing some of your work with me, and I thought it was absolutely fantastic, and I have zero doubt you are going to be a name that people will know very well very soon.
Well, thank you for saying that.
Yeah. So those publishers out there, editors, publishers, take note. I think he's someone that people should be taking a look out for. So. Yeah. I guess the first question is, you're writing. What made you want to write? When did you just start doing this? How long has it been?
Oh man, I have on and off. I've been writing since my early days, since I was a kid. My first taste was my father ran Dungeons and Dragons campaigns when I was in middle school. When I first became old enough to be aware of Dungeons and Dragons, he's been playing it since the late 70s. And he was just waiting for me to get excited about it. And so the first short stories that I remember writing were based for a campaign for Dungeons and Dragons when I was 10 or 11 years old. And they were kid stories about like swashbuckling knights and princesses and dragons and all of this stuff. But that was the first time I remember actually like sitting down and writing something was for that format, for that purpose of like a game, and sort of kept writing on and off as I got older.
Okay. And in terms of a group, I know that Melissa had mentioned, I can't remember if you beta read for her or she beta read for you, but it sounds like you guys have formed, maybe a few of you have formed kind of a group or tell me a little bit about that.
Yeah, for sure. So there's a writing community on Twitter, which is the platform that I operate most on. And it's very common, the more time you spend on this platform and communicating with other writers, you end up sharing bits and pieces of your work and asking for advice and help. And it is a community in the sense that, we're all in this endeavor together and we're all trying to like actively improve and level up our work. And you can only do that by yourself to a certain extent. After a while, you do have to get external feedback, and you need to get a pair of eyes that is relatively knowledgeable about writing and reading and plot structure to say, like, actually, yeah, this character arc is a little weak for these reasons, or your plot's getting meandering here. It's been several chapters since something important happened. And yeah, Melissa and I have interacted a handful of times on those levels where either a chapter or a whole piece of work is going around and somebody needs help with some aspect of it.
Okay. I mean, it's fascinating. And I bring that up, especially as young authors are trying to figure out where to get help, where to get advice. You know, I think it used to be obviously much more common where you'd have writing groups get together in person. I'm sure people still do that. Certainly not during COVID.
Certainly not. One would hope.
Yeah, but I just find it fascinating. You know, I know on Facebook there's some really interesting writing groups, and then obviously on Twitter. So I find it fascinating. In terms of your own work, you know, I know nothing is available quite yet in terms of published material, but I know it's coming. But one of the stories I heard a lot about was The Tribe, which sounds like that's kind of maybe a big one that hopefully will be coming soon. Tell us a little bit about that.
Yeah, so The Tribe is going to be, fingers crossed, my debut novel. Not the first that I've written, which is an important distinction to make when you're talking about like publishing works, but it's hopefully one of the first books that I'll have traditionally published. It's half a love letter to the Pacific Northwest wilds that I spend a lot of my free time in and really treasure and love. And it's a half horror story about like in the vein of like the great horror writers that I grew up with, like Stephen King is the obvious example that comes to mind. But I was out hiking in the woods one day, and it was a 2 or 3 day backpacking trip, and I was lying down in my tent at night. And I had the realization that if something were to happen, not only is there nobody around for upwards of 50 miles, so like nobody's going to hear me scream, and there's a 16th of an inch of fabric between me and the outside world that I have suddenly just decided is safe. I didn't sleep very well that night, and then the next day I started putting together the seeds that would eventually turn into The Tribe.
Okay, great. Well, I can't wait. I can't wait to read it. So I'm looking forward to it. You know, it's funny. One of the things, and I can't remember if I've said this before, but interesting thing about Stephen King that I just found out recently, I've been reading Avram's unpublished short autobiography.
Sure.
And he actually mentioned Stephen King in it. When Stephen King made his submission to fantasy and science fiction, Avram was the editor. And Avram used to send letters of encouragement back to young aspiring writers. And one of those was a 12-year-old Stephen King. And it was that letter back, apparently, that got Stephen really excited.
That's actually, I've been reading, or I've read On Writing, which is Stephen King's. It's also an autobiographical work, but it's sort of in the vein of like advice for new writers. But he talks about the process when he was young and submitting to these big magazines and these big places with short stories. And he does mention specific instances of like editors getting back to him with like encouraging words, that he like treasured those moments, which is like, that's what a crazy coincidence.
Well, tell me about your website. I thought it was a really interesting name. Just curious, you know, people can check you out at www.drunkscribe.com. Why Drunk Scribe?
Honestly, this is going to sound utterly ridiculous, but I needed a writing Twitter. I knew that the platform existed, and I wanted to partake and be part of this community. And on day one, I was sitting in front of my computer, and I thought, like, I need a name. I gotta call myself something. And wouldn't you know it, my real name was taken. Thanks, other guy that's got my name. But I was sitting. It was like 8 o'clock at night. I was sitting in front of my computer with a bottle of red wine, and I was like, well, I'm Drunk Scribe. Why not? Let's see if it's available. And it was available, and I hit confirm, and I'm sure I could change it if I wanted to, but it kind of nicely summarizes what I've got going on.
I love it. Well, one of the other things that I've learned about you is that you love cooking.
Yeah.
So I believe chef at some point. And, I thought about stories. I always like to think about the person. And so I thought the perfect story for you would have been Avram's Full Chicken Richness.
Full Chicken Richness. Yeah, I can't agree more.
And by the way, that we'll be listening to that in just a second. For those that want to know, it was first published in Last Wave, October 1983. So, I think with that, I say we take a listen.
Let's jump in. I'm excited.
Full Chicken Richness. La Bonne Burger was said to have the best hamburger on the street. The only trouble with that was that Fred Hopkins didn't care much for hamburger. However, there were other factors to consider, such as these. Other items on La Bonne's menu were probably just a bit better than comparable items composed elsewhere on the street. They sold for just a bit less than etc., etc., and also Fred Hopkins found the company just a bit more interesting than elsewhere, etc. What else? It was nearer to his studio loft than any eating place else. Any place else save for a small place called the Old Moulmein Pagoda, the proprietor of which appeared to speak very fluent Cantonese for a Burman, and the Old Moulmein Pagoda was not open until late afternoon. Late afternoon. Late morning was more Fred's style. He was likely to find there, at any given time of late morning, a number of regulars, such as, there was Tilly, former Ottilie, with red cheeks, her white hair looking wind-blown even on windless days. Tilly had her own little routine, which consisted of ordering coffee and toast. With the toast came a small plastic container of jelly, and this she spread on one of the slices of toast. That eaten, she would hesitantly ask Rudolfo if she might have more jelly, adding that she would pay for it. Rudolfo would hand her 1 or 2 or 3 more. She would tentatively offer him a palm of pennies and nickels, and he would politely decline them. Fred was much moved by this little drama, but after the 12th and succeedent repetitions, it left him motionless. Once he was to encounter Tilly in a disused doorway downtown, standing next to a hat with money, while she played, and played beautifully, endless Strauss waltzes on that rather un-Strauss-like instrument, the harmonica. Also unusually present in La Bonne Burger in the 40 minutes before the noon rush were Volodya and Karl. They were a sort of twosome there. That is, they were certainly not a twosome elsewhere. Karl was tall and had long blonde hair and a long blonde beard and was already at his place along the counter when Volodya walked in. Karl never said anything to Volodya. Volodya always said anything to Karl. Volodya was wide and gnarly and had small, pale eyes like those of a malevolent pig. Among the things he called Karl were Popa, Moskwev, Smaravachik, meaning, Fred Hopkins found out by and by, priest, inhabitant of Moscow, and one who, for immoral purposes, pretends to be a chimney sweep. Fred, by and by, tried to dissuade Volodya of this curious delusion. "He's a Minnesota Swede," Fred explained. But Volodya would have none of it. "He's a Russian Orthodox priest," was his explosive comeback, and he went on to denounce the last Tsar of Russia as having been in the pay of the Freemasons. Karl always said nothing, munched away as droplets of egg congealed on his beard. And there was, in La Bonne Burger, often, breaking fast on a single sausage and a cup of tea, a little old Oriental man, dressed as though for the winters of Manchuria. Once Fred had, speaking slowly and clearly, asked him please to pass the ketchup. "Say, I ain't deef," said the LOOM, in tones the purest American Gothic. Fred himself was not in the least eccentric. He was an artist, not even starving, though being unfashionably representational, not really prospering either. His agent said that this last was his, Fred's, own fault. "Paint doctors' wives," his agent insisted. "If you would only paint portraits for doctors' wives, I could get you lots of commissions. Old buildings," the agent said disdainfully. "Old buildings, old buildings. But the muse kisseth where she listeth, and if anything is not on the list, too bad." Fred had nothing against doctors' wives. Merely, he preferred to paint pictures of old buildings. Now and then, he drove around looking for old buildings he hadn't painted pictures of, and he photographed them and put the photos up by his canvas to help when he painted at home. This, of course, caused him to be regarded with scorn by purists who painted only from the model or the imagination. Why either should be less or more scornable, they disdained to say. Whom else was F. Hopkins likely to see in La Bonne Burger over his late breakfast or his brunch? Proprietors of nearby businesses, for example, he was likely to see there. Mama no longer brought Papa's dinner wrapped in a towel to keep hot. Abelardo was sometimes there. Also, Fred might see tourists or new emigres or visiting entrepreneurs of alien status come to taste the exotic tuna fish sandwich on toast, the picturesque macaroni and cheese, the curious cold turkey, and, of course, often, the native La Bonne Deluxe Special, said to be the best hamburger on the street. Abelardo had long looked familiar. Abelardo had, in fact, looked familiar from the first. Abelardo always came in from the kitchen, and Abelardo always went back out through the kitchen. And yet Abelardo did not work in the kitchen. Evidently, Abelardo delivered something. Once, carrying a plate of something, odd and fragrant, Rudolfo rested it a moment on the counter near Fred while he gathered cutlery. In response to Fred's look of curiosity and approbation, at once said, "Not on the menu. Only I give some to Abelardo because our family come from the same country." Off he went. Later, "You're not from Mexico, Rudolfo?" "No, South America." Rudolfo departs with glasses. Later, "Which country in South America you from, Rudolfo?" "Depend who you ask." Exit Rudolfo for napkins. Fred Hopkins, idly observing paint on two of his own fingers, idly wondered that, a disputed boundary being clearly involved, Rudolfo was not out leading marches and demonstrations, or, at least, with drippy brushes slapping up graffiti exhorting the reader to remember the 12th of January, the 3rd of April, the 24th of October, and so on through the existing political calendar of Ibero-America. Clearly, Rudolfo was an anachronism. Perhaps he secretly served some fallen sovereign, a pseudo-crypto emperor of Brazil. Perhaps, though probably not likely. One day, the hour being later than usual and the counter crowded, Fred's eyes wandered around in search of a seat. Met those of Abelardo, who wordlessly invited him to sit in the empty place at the two-person table. Which Fred did, and, so doing, realized why the man had always seemed familiar. Now suppose you are a foreigner living in a small city or medium town in Latin America, as Fred Hopkins had once been, and it doesn't really matter which city or town, or even which country, doesn't really matter for this purpose, and you are going slightly out of your mind trying to get your electricity, la luz, turned on, and eventually you notice that there are a few large stones never moved from the side of a certain street, and gradually notice that there is often the same man sitting on one of the boulders, and that this man wears very dusty clothes which do not match, and a hat rather odd for the locale, say a beret, and that he also wears glasses, and that the lens of one is opaque or dark, and that this man often gives a small wave of his hand to return the greetings of passers-by, but otherwise he merely sits and looks. You at length have occasion to ask him something, say, at what hour does the municipal palace open? And not only does the man politely inform you, he politely engages you in conversation, and before long he is giving you a fascinating discourse on an aspect of history, religion, economics, or folklore, an aspect of which you had been completely ignorant. Subsequent inquiry discloses that the man is, say, a Don Eliseo, who had attended the National University for 9 years but took no degree, that he is an idiosincratico and comes from a family muy honorado, so much honorado, in fact, that merely having been observed in polite discourse with him results in your electricity being conectido muy pronto. You have many discourses with Don Eliseo, and eventually he shows you his project, temporarily in abeyance, to perfect the best tortilla making and baking machine in the world. There is some minor problem, such as the difficulty of scraping every third tortilla off the ceiling, but any day now Don Eliseo will get this licked, and in the meanwhile, and forever after, his house is your house. This was why Abelardo had seemed familiar from the start. And if Abelardo was not Eliseo's brother, then he was certainly his nephew or his cousin. In the spirit, anyway. Out of a polite desire that Fred Hopkins not be bored while waiting to be served, Abelardo discussed various things with him. That is, for the most part, Abelardo discussed. Fred listened. La Bonne Burger was very busy. Now, the real weakness of the Jesuits in Paraguay, Abelardo explained. Now, in Western South America, said Abelardo, North American corporations are disliked less for their vices than for their virtues. Bribery, favoritism, we can understand these things. We live with them. But an absolute insistence that one must arrive in one's office day after day, at one invariable hour, and that frequent prolonged telephone conversations from one's office to one's home and family is unfavored, this is against our conception of personal and domestic usement, Abelardo explained. He assured Fred Hopkins that the Regent Isabella's greatest error, though she made several, was in having married a Frenchman. The Frankish temperament is not the Latin temperament, Abelardo declared. Fred's food eventually arrived. Abelardo informed him that although individual enterprise and planned economy were all very well in their own ways, one ignores the law of supply and demand at peril. I have been often in businesses, so I know, you see, said Abelardo. Abelardo did not indeed wear eyeglasses with one dark or opaque lens, but one of his eyes was artificial. He had gold in his smile, that is, in his teeth, and his white coverall was much washed, but never much ironed. By and by, with polite words and thanks for the pleasure of Fred's company, Abelardo vanished into the kitchen. When Fred strolled up for his bill, he was informed it had already been paid. This rather surprised Fred. So did the fact, conveyed to him by the clock, that the noon rush was over, had been over. Abelardo is a very nice guy. Rudolfo's face, hands, and body made brief but persuasive signal that it went without saying that Abelardo was indeed a very nice guy. But I don't know how he stay in business. said Rudolfo, picking up a pile of dishes and walking them off to the kitchen. Fred had no reason to remain to discuss this, as it was an unknown to him how anybody stayed in business. Merely he was well aware how week after week the price of paints and brushes and canvases went up, while the price of his artwork stayed the same. Well, his agent, though wrong, was right. No one to blame but himself. He could have stayed in advertising. He might be an account executive by now. Or, walking along the street, he felt a wry smile accompany memory of another of Abelardo's comments. Advertising is like courtship, always involves some measure of deceit. This made him quick-step a bit back to the studio to get in some more painting, for, he felt, tonight might be a good one for what one might call courtship. Exploitation, some would doubtless call it, though why? If ladies, women, did not like to come back to his loft studio and see his painting, why did they do so? And if they did not genuinely desire to remain for a while of varying length, who could make them? Did any one of them really desire to admire his art? Was there no pretense on the part of any of them? Why was he not the exploited one? You women are all alike. You only have one thing on your mind. All you think of is your own pleasure. Oh, well, hell, back to work. It was true that you could not sleep with an old building, but then they never argued with you either. And as for some measure of deceit, boy, did that work both ways. 2 weeks before, he'd come upon a harmonious and almost untouched, though tiny, commercial block in an area in between the factories and the farms, as yet undestroyed by the people curiously called developers. He'd taken lots of color snaps of it from all angles, and he wanted to do at least 2 large paintings, maybe 2 small ones as well. The date, 1895, was up there in front. The front was false, but in the harmony was truth. A day that found him just a bit tired of the items staple in breakfast found him ordering a cup of the soup du jour for starters. How you like the soup? Rudolfo. Fred gave his head a silent shake. How? It had gone down without exciting dismay. Truthful with you. Had better, had worse. What was it? Well, I was thinking of something else. Chicken vegetable with rice? Right? Right. Yours or Campbell's? Neither. Half mine, half Abelardo's. I beg your pardon. But Rudolfo had never heard the rude English story about the pint of half and half. Neither did Fred tell it to him. Rudolfo said, I make a stock with the bones after making chicken sandwiches, and I mix it with this. He produced a very large can, pushed it over to Fred. The label said, Full Chicken Richness, chicken-type soup. What? Asked Fred, half laughing. He read on. Ingredients: water, other poultry and poultry parts, dehydrated vegetables, chickens and chicken parts, seasoning. The list dribbled off into the usual list of chemicals. The label also said, canned for restaurant and institutional usement. Too big for a family, Rudolfo observed. Well, not bad, I think, too. Help me keep the price down. Every little bit help, you know. Oh, sure. No, not bad. But I wonder about that label. Rudolfo shrugged about that label. The government, he said, wasn't going to worry about some little Chico outfit way down from the outskirt of town. Fred chuckled at the bland non-identification of other poultry. Rudolfo said that turkey was still cheaper than chicken. But I don't put it down chicken soup. I put it down soup du jour. Anybody ask, I say, oh, you know, chicken and rice and vegetable and, oh, stuff like that. Try it. You don't like it, I don't charge you. Fair enough? Yes. He expanded. Abelardo, he is no businessman. He is a philosopher. His mind is always in the skies. I tell him I could use more soup, twice, maybe even 3 times as many cans. What he cares? Supply and demand, he says. Then he tells me about the old Dutch explorers, things like that. Hey, I ever tell you about the time he make his own automobile? Abelardo did? Sure, Abelardo did. He took a part from one car, a part from another. He takes parts not even from cars. I don't know what they're from. Fred thought of Don Eliseo and the more perfect tortilla making and baking machine. Well, it worked. Finally, yes, it start off yum, like a rocket, 63 miles an hour. But oh boy, when he tried to slow it down, it stopped. He started again, 63 miles an hour. No other rate of speed. Well, what can you do with such a car? So he forgot about it, and he invents something else, who knows what. Then he go into the soup business. Yes, sir, you ready to order? Rodolfo moved on. So did Fred. The paintings of the buildings 1895 were set aside for a while so that he could take a lot of pictures of a turn-of-the-century family home scheduled for destruction real soon. This site will be improved with a modern office building. What the hell did they mean by improved? Alice came up and looked at the sketches of the family home and at finished work. I like them, she said. I like you. She stayed. Everything fine. Then, one day, there was the other key on the table. On the note, there is nothing wrong, it said. Just time to go now. Love. No name. Fred sighed, went on painting. One morning late, there was Abelardo in the bun. He nodded, smiled a small smile. By and by, some coffee down. Fred said, Say, where do you buy your chickens? Abelardo, ready to inform, though not yet ready to talk, took a card from his wallet. E.J. Binder Prime Poultry Farm. Also, Game Birds Dressed to Order. 1330 Valley Road, by the Big Oak. While Fred was still reading this, Abelardo passed him over another card, this one for the Full Chicken Richness Canned Soup Company. You must visit me, he said. Most time I am home. Fred hadn't really cared where the chickens were bought, but now the devil entered into him. First, he told Abelardo the story about the man who sold rabbit pie. Asked, wasn't there any way maybe some horse meat in the rabbit pie? Said it was 50-50. 1 rabbit, 1 horse. Abelardo reflected, then issued another small smile, a rather more painful one. Fred asked, what about the turkey meat in your chicken-type soup? I mean, the other poultry parts. Abelardo squinted. Only the breast, he said. The rest not good enough. For the soup, I mean. The rest I sell to some mink ranchers. How's business? Abelardo shrugged. He looked a bit peaked. Supply, he said. Demand, he said. Then he sighed, stirred, rose. You must visit me, any time, please, he said. Abelardo wasn't there in the La Bonne Burger next late morning, but someone else was. Miles Martin, call him the last of the old-time land agents, call him something less nice. There he was. Been waiting, Miles Martin said. Remember time I told you about old stagecoach building? You never came. It coming down tomorrow. Ranch houses. Want to take its picture? Last chance today. Make me a nice little painting of it. Price is right, I buy it. Bye now. Down Fred went. Heartbreaking to think its weathered timbers, its mellowed red brick chimney and stone fireplace were coming down. But Fred Hopkins was very glad he'd had the favor of a notice. Coming down, too, the huge trees with the guinea fowl in them. Lots of photographs. Be a good painting, at least one. Driving back, lo, a sign saying E.J. Binder Prime Poultry Farm. Absolutely by a big oak. Still, Fred probably wouldn't have stopped if there hadn't been someone by the gate. Binder, maybe. Sure enough, Binder. Say, do you know a South American named Abelardo? No problem. Sure I do. Used to be a pretty good customer, too. Buy, I forget how many chickens a week. Don't buy many nowadays. He send you here? Be glad to oblige you. Binder was an oldish man, highly sun-speckled. You supply his turkeys and turkey parts, too? The devil still inside Fred Hopkins. Old Binder snorted. Turkeys? No, we don't handle turkeys, no sir. Why, chickens are enough trouble. Cost of feeding going up, and no guinea fowl. No, we never did. Just chickens, and of course your Cornish. Still civil, E.J. Binder gave vague directions toward what he believed, he said, was the general location of Mr. Abelardo's place. Fred didn't find it right off, but he found it. As no one appeared in response to his calling and honking, he got out and knocked. Nothing. Pues? My house is your house! Okay, in he went through the first door. Well, it wasn't a large cannery, but it was a cannery. Fred started talking to himself. Solitary artists often do. Way I figure it, Abelardo, he said, is that you have been operating with that small measure of deceit in advertising, as you so aptly put it. I think that in your own naive way, you have believed that so long as you called the product chicken-type soup and included some chicken, well, it was all right. Okay, your guilty secret is safe with me. Where are you? The place was immaculate, except for a pile of, well, shit, right in the middle of an aisle. It was as neat as a pile of shit can be. Chicken shits, pigeon poops, turkey trots. Quien sabe? At the end of the aisle was another door, and behind that door was a small apartment, and in a large chair in the small apartment lay sprawled Abelardo, dead drunk on mezcal, mujik-grade vodka, and sneaky pet, according to the evidence. Alcoholism is not an especially Latin American trait? Who said the poor guy was an alcoholic? Maybe this was the first time he'd ever been stewed in his life. Maybe the eternally perplexing matter of supply and demand had finally unmanned him. Maybe. At the other end of that room was another door, and behind that other door was another room. And in that other room was something else. The other room was partly crammed with an insane assortment of machinery and allied equipment, compared to which Don Eliseo's more perfect make-and-bake tortilla engine, with its affinities to the perpetual motion invention of one's choice, was simplicity. The thing stood naked for Fred's eyes, but his eyes told him very little. Wires snaked all around, that much he could say. There was a not-quite click. A large television screen flickered on. No. Whatever it was, at the room's end, sitting flush to the floor with a low chicken wire fence around it, it was not television. Not even if Abelardo had started from scratch, as though there had been no television before. The quality of the image was entirely different, for one thing, and the color, for another, was wrong. And wrong in the way that no TV color he had ever seen had been wrong. He reached to touch the screen. There was no screen. It was as though his hand met a surface of unyielding gelatin. The non-screen, well, what the hell, call it a screen, was rather large, but not gigantically so. He was looking at a savanna somewhere, and among the trees were palms, and he could not identify the others. A surf pounded not far off, but he could not hear it. There was no sound. He saw birds flying in and out of the trees. Looking back, he saw something else. A trail of broken bread through the room right up to the, screen. A silent breeze now and then rifled grass, and something moved in the grass to one side. He stepped back slightly. What the hell could it mean? Then the something which was in the grass to one side stepped, stiff-legged, into full view, and there was another odd, small sound as the thing, it was a bird, lurched through the screen and began to gobble bread. Hopkins watched, dry-mouthed. Crumb by crumb it ate. Then there was no more bread. It dawdled up to the low fence, dawdled back. It approached the screen. It brushed the screen. There was a Rube Goldberg series of motions in the external equipment. A sheet of chicken wire slid noisily down to the floor. The bird had been trapped. Fred got down and peered into the past till his eyes and neck grew sore, but he could not see one more bird like it. He began to laugh and cry simultaneously. Then he stood up. "Inevitable," he croaked, throwing out his arms. "Inevitable. Demand exceeded supply." The bird looked up at him with imbecile, incurious eyes and opened its incredible beak. "Do-do," it said, halfway between a gobble and a coo. "Do-do, do-do."
All right, what'd you think?
Man, the first time I read it, I was so struck by its uniqueness and its unique voice, and it's only reinforced by what we just listened to. I don't think I've ever encountered a short story quite in that vein.
No, you correct me if I'm wrong. And a lot of authors, especially of an older generation, know who Avram is, but younger writers may not know. I mean, was this your first exposure to Avram?
First ever, yeah. And it was curious because when we first got together and started talking about Avram, I was like, okay, I'd like this person sounds interesting. And then you sent me, the first time I read Full Chicken Richness was in the Avram Davidson Treasury, which you sent me, which is several hundred pages long of short stories and material that I had literally never heard of. And I was like, how have I existed in this sphere of writers? Because like as a writer, I also read a lot and I'm constantly consuming people's material and words and trying to broaden my experience in that arena. And I was just struck, like, how have I let this entire mass of writing and voice go unnoticed?
Yeah. What jumped out at you about the story in particular?
Honestly, the first thing that popped out to me in the story was the Roald Dahl-like cast of characters that Avram has working there. In short stories, in today's sort of like traditionally published market, short stories are very punchy. They're very tense and atmosphere based, and they've got like things going on, and it's very visceral. So reading this story, I was struck by the amount of time that Avram took to sidestep into Tilly and some of the other people that were in La Bun Burger.
Right. Yeah, no, and for me, it was, I always look at it from a cinematic view, and I think about like this felt like an episode of Cheers at the beginning. I mean,
yeah, exactly.
All these characters in a short time, including his, quick girlfriend Alice.
Yeah, and it's really interesting too, because it walks a fine line between introducing a cast of characters who are interesting but not necessarily imperative to the plot of the short story. Obviously, the characters, the setting, and Abelardo in particular is important to the story, but Tilly isn't. And so the amount of care that Avram takes to like talk about Tilly, but also like show you pieces of that person's backstory without just dumping it on you in a big info dump. Here's this person, part and parcel. He takes the time to tell you about how she orders small containers of jelly that she offers to pay for with like sweat slicked coins in her palm, that Rudolpho is obviously like, no, I'm not going to take that money. He doesn't tell you this is Tilly, a homeless person. He says, this is Tilly. This is what's important to her. This is how she pays for it. And it's very minute, and you can tell the amount of care taken to really show those characters to the reader and let them build that image in their mind.
Yeah, I think I've noticed with a lot of Avram's stories, he'll take in the first few paragraphs. I mean, I'm starting to get a better sense. He'll take in the first few paragraphs and create this entire, in this case, it's the universe of this restaurant, and create this just incredible, universe at this restaurant that you've now got in your head, and all these characters, but in such a short time span.
Right, in three pages, or however much time that takes to read, at your reading style. It's one of those things where like you don't see that very often in popular fiction these days, because so many people are like straight to the point. What's the tension? What are the stakes? Where are we going? Let's get there. And you see it across a lot of media, not just writing, but also in like film and television. Like everybody's like, what's the stakes? Where are we? And it's like, right now we're in this restaurant, and yeah, you're gonna listen about Tilly for a bit, and you're gonna like it.
Another thing that I thought was interesting was the character Fred Hopkins, the painter, and I was thinking to myself, I mean, it was basically Avram as a painter.
Sure, yeah.
Having to deal with agents and not making a ton of money because he really wants to paint buildings instead of writing.
The fun parallel was also like, if you want to compare it to Avram, it's also like an artist who's kind of stubbornly into doing this one thing that maybe his commercial agent is trying to persuade him to do maybe something similar, but that sells a little bit better. And Fred Hopkins is like, I just want to paint old buildings, man.
No, I mean, that with Avram, there's no doubt he could have written whatever he wanted to write.
Mm-hmm.
He could have written space operas that would have been huge movies and success.
Sure, yeah.
He could have written about elves and dragons and wizards and would have had huge success. But, he wanted to write about old buildings.
He wanted to write about old buildings. He wanted to write about it his way. And that was another thing that struck me about reading Full Chicken Richness and more of Avram's work, is there is a significant, for better or for worse, there's a significant buy-in price for a reader. Because you're immediately struck by the quality of writing, but he also makes a point of reinforcing to the reader, like, we're gonna get where we're going eventually, but we're gonna do it my way.
Totally.
And you're just on that ride with it.
All right. I always do this. I talk again from a cinematic perspective.
Mm-hmm.
There were a lot of interesting again, I felt like it was a cast of characters from Cheers, so you could have a ton of characters, but I thought the one who was obviously the most interesting to me, at least, and the biggest focus was Abelardo.
Mm-hmm.
And so, who would you pick? This guy with what, an artificial eye, gold teeth. I mean, such an interesting character. Any thoughts on who you would have picked to play him?
as far as like a popular commercial actor who's kind of well known, it's going to sound like an odd choice, but I'm into it. I'm going to go with Danny Trejo.
Okay, tell me who that is.
So Danny Trejo is, if you've seen, the first thing I ever saw him in as a kid was Spy Kids.
Okay.
He played the sort of tough uncle.
Yeah.
Yeah, he's got a very gritty sort of outward persona where he's this like tough, muscular, is covered in tattoos. Believe he may have served time. I don't know. But he's just a really tough person. But he's got this like method of speaking that Abelardo has, which is, I don't know, it's just like punchy philosophical statements. But I also enjoyed the difference in my head, at least in my imagination, of having this really intimidating looking individual just rambling about supply and demand in an oblique way that the reader eventually wonders to themselves, like, are we gonna like get to this at some point, or are we just rolling down these tracks?
Oh man. So for me, I spent a little time doing some research. First, I was trying to find Paraguayan actors.
Okay.
And I couldn't find too many.
Yeah, I would imagine.
Some much older ones. So then I started looking South American. Then all of a sudden, this guy, Adam Rodriguez, who's on CSI Miami, and what jumped out at me is he was born in Yonkers, which is where Avram was from.
Yeah, okay.
You know, Avram has a lot of Latinx type stories, and having someone who was born in Yonkers would be pretty meaningful.
Yeah, well, and also the character definitely has a younger voice too, so I might agree with your choice over mine.
Yeah, he's 45, so
yeah,
you know, definitely younger
but, for sure.
Yeah. Well, anything before this has been, I've really enjoyed this. Anything else from your end that you'd like to add, bring up?
I mean, first of all, I just want to thank you for like introducing me to being my introduction to Avram and everything that he's written and worked on. It's a huge depth of material that I now get to like dive into, and surprise my friends with like, oh, I've got this new person that I'm reading, and they're like, oh yeah, is he new? No, you should have heard of him. But yeah, I just want to tell everybody listening to you can follow me on Twitter at DrunkScribe. Love to interact with you, love to hear from you, and yeah, keep an eye out for The Tribe. It's coming out sometime, somewhere. Very excited about it. You can also check out, I've got a couple of short stories on my website, drunkscribe.com. Yeah, that's what I got going on.
That's great. And I'll make sure, obviously, once it comes out, I'll make sure to announce it. I can't wait. And, let's stay in touch. But anyways, it's been great. I can't thank you enough.
And yeah, thank you so much for having me.
Yeah, absolutely.
All right. Have a great one.
You too.